Hello everyone, my name is Shauna Sylvester and I'm going to be speaking about from debate to dialogue. So when you hear the word debate, what do you think? You think about, I want to be right. I listen for somebody's argument and I'm listening for the gaps in their argument. I'm trying to figure out how I can use what they're saying and turn it to my benefit. So I want to win a debate. In dialogue, it's very different. I'm trying to listen so that I can build in somebody's argument, so that I can find the center of that discussion, and I can, through discussion, through real dialogue, come to a different place. So the transition from debate to dialogue is actually quite difficult to make, and I can speak to it because I am a born debater. I grew up in a family, a very Catholic family, fourth of 5 children, and the idea of a dinner table conversation wasn't a civilized conversation in our house. You need to be able to be heard. You had to be able to formulate an argument. I had to be able to spar. And my Jesuit-educated brother, when he got really dismissive and aggressive in his rhetoric, I had to go for the jugular. That was the only way I was going to be heard. And that really served me well because by grade 3, I was going after Sister Geraldine because she had punished me for not writing in the Maclean's cursive style of writing. By grade 9, I led a revolt in our girls' school because we didn't have a gym and we didn't have an adequate science lab, and I thought girls should have that. So my debating served me well. It served me very well. And through debating, I also worked here in Nanaimo. I was a debater. I won Ravenhurst in my debating years. It was a very good thing. I was working on banning the bomb. I went through schools throughout Vancouver Island to ban the bomb. And that debating led to 15 years of activism. I worked on the rights for the poverty, working on people living in poverty and their rights. I worked on women's issues. I worked in many countries around the world, working as an activist. I would say that for 15 years, I was very, very good at oppositional politics. I could use words to advance policy change. And that all changed for me in 1999. In 1999, I got an email from a man named Sandeep Waslekar in Mumbai, India. He was with the Center for Peace Initiatives. And he asked me to take on a role in terms of convening a Track 2 dialogue. Now, for those of you that follow foreign policy, Track 2 dialogues are when you bring people out of their official positions, you bring them in, often behind closed doors, they take their hats off, they get out of their positions, and they try and come to solutions on things. That's a Track 2 dialogue. Now, he wanted a Canadian organization to help convene a Track 2 dialogue among the media barons of South Asia. These were the Rupert Murdochs and the Conrad Blacks of South Asia, the indigenous language press. They had millions of readers, and these people, with the power of their pen, could make or break a politician, and they could certainly escalate a conflict. Now, this was a time in 1999. If you remember, in 1998, both India and Pakistan had tested nuclear weapons. It was also a time when India and Pakistan were involved in a very dangerous conventional warfare called the Kargil crisis in the Kashmir district. And many, many people thought that that was going to turn into a nuclear war. So bringing this group together was, in their minds, a critical component in the conflict resolution process. So I agreed. And I was the only non-South Asian in this group. And this group met in Kathmandu. And it was also just after General Musharraf had come to power, and the regional council, the South Asian Regional Council, refused to meet. And yet we were bringing the South Asian editors together. And I remember that very first day of meetings. This is the Kargil crisis. This is the group that I was working with. That first day of meetings was tense. It was hostile, particularly among the Indians and Pakistani editors. They didn't like each other, they had very little knowledge of each other, and they certainly didn't have much respect. And so throughout the day, the tensions grew. Now, my job was to hold the space. So after dinner, I continued to stay in the room to try and make sure that nothing became violent. Continued on, 1 o'clock in the morning, 2 o'clock in the morning. Now alcohol's flowing, and I'm getting very concerned. We're now at 3 o'clock in the morning. And I remember thinking, as I think that violence is going to ensue, I heard a Pakistan editor turn to an Indian editor And they started to make a connection and realize they were actually related, that they were family members and their families had been divided through partition. And you could hear the hush in the room as everyone listened as they traced their roots. And all of a sudden, the tension was gone. Everything changed. It went from debate to storytelling to excessive teasing of each other. And that was the kind of flow that happened for the next 2 days. We shifted from debate to dialogue. And that group of people actually created the Kathmandu Accord to start governing their efforts in using their influence to stop the conflict and to advance peace and development in the region. You know, that was a life-changing point for me, because I walked out of that room and I remember going home on the plane and I said, could I do what they did? My life was based on oppositional politics. I was really good at telling how wrong the opposition was. Could I actually walk towards the opposition? And that's when I started to change almost everything I was doing to start working in the realm of dialogue, to start trying to find a way of getting to a different place. I realized if I was going to be effective at social change, I had to come to terms with my own issues around conflict and around my activism. Now I'm going to fast forward, because Carbon Talks was created out of that desire for dialogue. I work at Carbon Talks. Carbon Talks is an organization based at the SFU Center for Dialogue, and we focus on working with those working in transitions to a low-carbon economy. I was part of the Copenhagen meetings, and while I was there, I realized that nation-states were not going to deal with climate change, that they were relinquishing their power and their energy and their interest in dealing with climate change. So I started to say, okay, how do we deal with this? We've got to get to GHG reduction. Every issue I've ever cared about in the world is being affected by this issue. So how do we move? And looked around and determined that regional governments, local governments, municipalities were at the leading edge of trying to transition to a low-carbon economy. Now what we do is we work with municipalities who have made that decision, but they don't have the right people around the table to make it from intent to action. And so we work and we bring those track 2 dialogue tools to those tables, and we work to try and get solutions of moving that desire, that policy, to an actual strategy. And we've done this across Canada. We've worked with Toronto on geothermal in the retrofit market, district energy in Calgary, fugitive emissions in the oil and gas sector, and we worked a great deal in Vancouver in trying to achieve their Greenest City Action Plan. And one of the things I've learned about bringing disparate groups together is that so many of them think that they have the answer when they walk in the room. And I think it's a little bit like the parable of the blind. As they look at the elephant, it's a wall, it's a tree, because they can't see everything. And this happens, and it generally happens in the first 2 hours of any dialogue. But if you give enough time, something happens. Usually it's about 1:30 in the afternoon on a full-day dialogue. People start to realize that they don't have all the answers, that they need to build on each other's ideas, and things start to shift. And if enough time is given, you can get to a better place and viable solutions. We've shown that over and over again. And there are times, I have to say, though, that the activist comes back in me. This is such a serious issue, and there are so many times I've wanted to hit the streets to try and push the federal government to get to a carbon pricing policy. And I have to stop and I have to think about that group in South Asia. I don't know if you remember, but a few years ago in Gujarat, there was a major bloodbath. Hindus and Muslims killed, thousands and thousands killed. And many of the members of the South Asian Editors Forum were approached by various factions and said, you have to follow and report on this issue in the way we think you should report on it. One editor was told his daughter would not exist the next day if they didn't see a story written in a certain way. And that group got together and they made a decision that they were going to ensure that the Gujarat attacks never went beyond Gujarat, that they didn't spill into a bloodbath throughout the region, and they held tight. And I started to think about, what is it about that? What is that long-term structural change? And I think it comes back to that the fact that dialogue is about connecting us by what brings us together, not what divides us. It's understanding our humanity. It's understanding that we live in relationship to one another. It's creating the spaces for empathy and compassion. And although structures and systems confine us, we also create those structures and systems. So I think the whole role of dialogue is to understand how we can recreate and envision new futures. So now when I go home to those Sunday night dinners, and I often go home, I find myself with my eldest brother particularly as he starts to get very aggressive with his rhetoric. I stop and I've started to listen to him. I've started to actually hear what he says and not get my back up. And it's quite amazing. He's actually quite smart. Thank you.